God is dead is one of the most famous, most shocking lines in philosophy, and it comes from a man named Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker whose words have made generations pause, question, and sometimes even argue. Let's set the scene. Europe, late 1800s. Cities are buzzing with new inventions. Science is changing everything people thought they knew. The church, once the center of daily life, is losing influence. Old traditions and unquestioned beliefs are starting to wobble. People are waking up to a world that feels different than the one their parents knew. Imagine living in a time when everything that seemed certain begins to shake. When the foundations of life, morality, and society are suddenly uncertain. It's a world full of energy, change, and uncertainty. And right in the middle of it all is Nietzsche, observing, thinking, writing, and daring to speak boldly. Now, you might wonder, why would a philosopher choose such a dramatic phrase? Why use words that immediately make people stop and react? The answer is part of what makes Nietzsche so fascinating. His ideas were never subtle. They were meant to spark curiosity, to make people look around and say, wait, what's really happening here? And that's exactly what this video is about. We're going to travel back in time, explore the world Nietzsche lived in, meet the ideas and tensions of his era, and see why a simple sentence could ignite so much discussion, even over a century later. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let yourself wonder. What could God is dead possibly mean? Why did Nietzsche say it at all? And how did the world react when these words first appeared? Stick with me for the next few minutes, because we're about to step into a world of ideas that are bold, surprising, and completely unforgettable. All right, now that we've set the stage in the introduction, let's dive a little deeper into the world Nietzsche lived in. The historical and intellectual currents that shaped his thoughts. Europe in the late 1800s was a place of enormous change. Cities were growing, factories were booming, and science was challenging old ways of thinking. People were discovering things about the natural world that had been unimaginable just decades before. And these discoveries weren't just facts. They were shaking the very foundation of how people understood life, morality, and the universe. At the same time, religion, which had once guided nearly every aspect of daily life, was losing some of its unquestioned authority. People began to wonder if the moral rules and traditions they had always followed were really universal, or if they were just part of a system that no longer fit the changing world. Nietzsche was watching all of this unfold. He was deeply aware of the tension between the old beliefs and the new knowledge. Philosophers, scientists, and thinkers were asking questions that didn't have easy answers. Evolution, for example, challenged the literal interpretation of sacred texts. Industrialization changed how people lived and worked. Even the rise of democratic and individualist ideas was shaking the old social hierarchies. Imagine living in a time where everything that seemed permanent, the church, the moral codes, the unquestioned truths, suddenly feels unstable. That's the world Nietzsche observed, and he responded with a bold, provocative statement. God is dead. It wasn't just a random provocation. It was a reflection of a world in transition, a world where people could no longer rely on the old anchors to guide their understanding of life and meaning. This cultural and intellectual shift was intense, confusing, and exciting all at once. So, understanding the historical and intellectual currents of Nietzsche's time gives us a glimpse into why he felt compelled to speak so boldly. It helps us see that his statement wasn't made in isolation. It was part of a larger conversation about knowledge, belief, and the human experience in a rapidly changing world. Stick with me, because next we'll explore what that sentence actually did to people's minds and societies, and why it's still so powerful today. All right? Now that we've looked at the historical and intellectual context, let's focus on the philosophical side of Nietzsche's famous line, "God is dead." When Nietzsche wrote this, he wasn't trying to shock people just for the sake of it. He was observing a major shift in human thought. Think about it. For centuries, people had relied on certain frameworks to understand life, morality, and the world around them. These frameworks were often rooted in religion. They were stable, predictable, and widely accepted. But things were changing. Philosophical, scientific, and social developments were challenging these long-standing assumptions. Suddenly, the old guides didn't feel as reliable anymore. People began questioning the absolute truths that had once shaped their lives. And Nietzsche noticed this. So what does it mean, philosophically, to say God is dead? It's not about a literal deity disappearing. Instead, it's about the decline of absolute beliefs and unquestioned moral systems. Nietzsche was highlighting that humans were entering a period where they couldn't take these old certainties for granted. Now, imagine how unsettling that must have felt. If the moral and spiritual guides you've relied on all your life are no longer taken for granted, where do you turn? How do you make sense of right and wrong, purpose and meaning? Nietzsche's statement raises these questions and invites people to think critically, even if it feels uncomfortable. This is where his philosophy gets so intriguing. He didn't simply say, everything is lost. Instead, he was pointing out a reality that people had to face. The world was changing, the old certainties were fading, and humans had to start grappling with that truth. So in a way, God is dead is less about the end of religion and more about opening up a space for reflection, questioning, and awareness. It's a phrase designed to make people pause, look around, and consider, what do I truly believe and why? In the next section, we'll explore what happened as society began to face this new reality and how Nietzsche's bold ideas influenced the way people thought about morality, culture, and life itself. Now that we've explored the philosophical meaning behind Nietzsche's statement, let's talk about what happened next, the consequences of God is dead, and the challenge of nihilism. Nietzsche noticed this emerging in his time. As traditional values weakened, he saw how people could feel lost, unanchored, or even despairing. The collapse of old moral certainties didn't just create intellectual questions. It had real emotional and social consequences. People began asking, if the old rules no longer apply, what should I live for? What gives life meaning? But here's where it gets interesting. Nietzsche didn't simply warn about nihilism. He offered a bold, creative response. He suggested that instead of relying on old, inherited values, humans could become active creators of their own values. He introduced the concept of the Übermensch, or overman, an individual who embraces the freedom to define meaning and purpose in a world without guaranteed answers. Think of it like this. When the old scaffolding of belief is removed, many people might feel unstable. But Nietzsche saw an opportunity, a chance for humans to build their own structures, to take responsibility for their lives and create something new. It's a call to courage, imagination, and self-determination. So the consequences of God is dead are not just about loss or emptiness. They're about facing a turning point in human history, where the old certainties are gone, and it's up to each individual to navigate life, define purpose and create values that feel real and meaningful. In the next section, we'll wrap everything together, looking at why this idea still resonates today and how it continues to challenge and inspire people around the world. So far, we've explored the meaning, historical context, and philosophical implications of Nietzsche's famous statement, "God is dead." But how did people react when this idea spread? And how did institutions like the church respond? Nietzsche's statement was provocative, to say the least. Not everyone was ready to hear such a bold claim. The church, in particular, saw it as a challenge to centuries of religious authority. Critics accused him of undermining morality, spreading chaos, and questioning the foundations of society. It was controversial, polarizing, and sometimes even scandalous. Yet Nietzsche himself was not naive about the reactions. He understood the power of his words and the shock they could create. He deliberately used strong, unsettling language to capture attention and force people to confront uncomfortable truths. This wasn't just philosophy for the sake of thinking. It was philosophy as a wake-up call, pushing society to face its assumptions and question its guiding principles. So why did Nietzsche feel it was necessary to say it? In part because he saw a world where traditional beliefs were weakening, yet people were still clinging to old moral structures. He wanted to highlight the tension, to spark reflection, and to encourage humans to take responsibility for creating their own values. Saying God is dead was a dramatic way to shake people out of complacency and get them thinking. And the impact on society? It was profound. Philosophers, writers, and artists engaged with his ideas. Some were inspired, some resisted, and some struggled with the unsettling implications. Over time, his bold statement helped open the door for new ways of thinking about morality, meaning, and human freedom. Even today, the phrase continues to provoke thought and debate. So, understanding the critiques, the church's reactions, and Nietzsche's approach gives us insight into how one statement could ripple across culture, philosophy, and society, and why it remains so powerful more than a century later.